Lakeland Currents, your public affairs program for north central Minnesota. Production funding for Lakeland Currents is made possible by Bemidji Regional Airport, serving the region with daily flights to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. More information available at bemidjiairport.org. Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Online at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, friends. I'm Jason Eden, your host of Lakeland Currents. Thanks for joining the conversation again, and thanks for your ongoing support of Lakeland Public TV. Even though most of us are fortunate to live here in a part of the world where we have access to clean water, many of us still take safe drinking water for granted. However, it is no accident that we have access to clean water. Behind the scenes, hundreds of people throughout our region ensure and work tirelessly to ensure that you have safe drinking water, and also to ensure the health and well-being of those folks who live downstream. Here to help us understand how municipalities keep our water clean is Charlie Gammon from Brainerd Public Utilities and an unsung environmental hero. Charlie, welcome to the program, and thanks for making time for our conversation today.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, let's just zoom way out, and I'd like to get kind of a big picture understanding of how municipalities keep our water clean, both on the intake side, of course, and then after we've used our water. So what can you tell us from a big picture?
Well, a lot goes into that. It's really starting from the 1970s when we kind of enacted a Clean Water Drinking Act, and the regulations began to come down. And we had some standard operating procedures kind of throughout the region at that point, or something to work off of. So that came down from EPA. So when we look at the federal level and we look at a state level, we look at the framework in which that is established. So that gives us some goals to achieve. And it also gives us some standardization. So when we look at the big picture and the big scope, how does that work? Where do we get our water from, and how do we protect it? So it's a step system. So each box needs to be a check. So each community might be a little bit different, and then the rural setting. So how we look at it is, where is the water going to be coming from in that region? So if it's a well, a surface intake, and then what constituents are in that water, whether it be a river intake like the Mississippi, surface water, which is a totally different type of operation and treatment facility, to a well system. We have wells here in Brainerd Public Utilities that we manage and operate. So we'll pull it out of the ground, so it's groundwater, and from an aquifer, and look at what's in there and involved. So you might have iron and manganese. There is certain constituents. Some people are lucky in some regions to get really good water and be able to put it right from the well to the distribution system. Here we find iron and manganese. Iron and manganese can be, it's a secondary, or it's not health, but it's one of those taste, odor, and smell categories.
Okay.
So we put it through a sand filter and so on. How do we protect it? Throughout the years, we've established what they call wellhead protection, or zones, that we look at, and we don't want to, we kind of manage a little bit different. So we watch them areas pretty close. So to take it from the ground and treat it and put it in the distribution system for people, we then also know where that recharge zone for them wells are. So we can watch that area pretty close and monitor and plan around things that may not be very good for the soil, or things that we want to watch for stormwater runoff, weather or infiltration, and that type of thing. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it triggers a bunch of other questions. So let me make sure I understand this. If I live in Brainerd, I'm hearing you say that my water is coming from a well as opposed to surface intake. Is that correct? So it's not coming from the Mississippi. It is coming from a well here.
No, it's coming from the well source. So it's a groundwater source. So yeah, that's a whole different animal when we're looking at communities and we're looking at different operations. This one's a groundwater source or a well production.
So then you also have to, as you said, protect that wellhead area. So you're also looking at and monitoring and concerned about stormwater runoff as well. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We try to watch everything. So we can, with the extensive people that we have in a municipality, you have, building, zoning, and all that play into part with this. So we'll be in discussions if there's something that might be impacting or could impact, or, we're real careful with that area, that zone. Sometimes that reach, goes outside the city limits too. And so when we're dealing with agencies, let's say, we might pull in the agricultural agency and look at that, the egg, when, I guess, so it's a team effort throughout the agencies also. So when we're looking at that impact zones or the critical areas, we'll be watching which way the agencies have many different departments. So we might be looking or discussing with the geological formations and looking at that area. So where is that recharge zone for that aquifer and where is it coming from? So it may be high, very far reaching, and it can be pretty small depending on how much water you have in that area.
Interesting. So you just shared that Brainerd gets most of its water from well water. Are there a lot of municipalities that have this surface intake that you mentioned?
So one that's in concern that I'm concerned about being that, once we produce it and use it and it comes back and then we have to treat it again to put it back in the Mississippi River. Not only am I concerned, but my closest intake downstream is St. Cloud. So St. Cloud, Minnesota, also, they have a surface intake. So if I can do a really good job here, then I'm not worried about there. There's a lot of discharges between here and there, but I need to do my part too, not only environmentally, by our discharge permit and by their drinking water. So I'm concerned with my surroundings. So where I discharge and where we have common interest.
That's a huge responsibility to put water back into the watershed and know that a community is going to be drawing the very same water for its drinking water. So tell us a little bit about how that process works. How do you clean the water to such an extent that I, as a resident of a downstream community, can drink it with confidence?
So as we produce it and go through treatment and put it in the distribution, and then we go to services and industries, and then we collect it within our collection system. Brainerd currently has 17 individual lift stations that we have to maintain and operate, which are very important to get conveyance of the wastewater here. Also, Brainerd Public Utilities, maybe some people don't know, we also treat all the wastewater for Baxter's residents. So they handle their lift stations and collection, but we get their influent. So an influent, is just what they use and produce and then get wasted here.
Sure.
So once that happens throughout that network, and there's a world below surface, so what we call infrastructure or asset management. So when we look at the big picture, and I'm going to fly way back out again.
Please.
There's a whole nother world of utilities that go into what we do. So when we look at fire, when we look at public safety, when we look at emergencies, resiliency emergencies, so we have to be on guard 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And so to bring that service to people that they can be confident of drinking the water. When we receive it here, we have a process which is better known as a SBR, a sequential batch reactor. So it goes through a pre-screening, it goes through biologically treating. So in other words, microorganisms are my friend, viruses, bacteria, all that. And I utilize their ability biologically. So we mimic wetlands, we mimic a lot of the technology that goes into treating wastewater and water is a mimic of the environment.
Biomimicry.
Yep. So when we look at biomass or we look at a volume of an organism and we put unclean water, wastewater into it, we want that biology and microorganisms to clean it for us. So that's what I manage, is a live, living treatment plant. And so same goes with water and distribution and everything else. When we start looking at that, that's one thing we want to avoid. So it's kind of a flip of the coin when we look at where we're doing and what. So it's hard to explain, and it's very difficult to manage. So I guess the best way to try to explain is it's an immense amount of technical and knowledge that goes into what we do. So when you say wastewater, at the early beginnings, the meager beginnings, if you had drinking water, you'd take the pan and throw it out on the street, right? I mean,
Right.
we realized as a nation very early on, whether it be air, soil, or water, that we have to be careful because diseases come from this, right? So when we look at our treatment facilities, and I don't want to get too technical, but utilizing microbiology and utilizing them free swimmers, rotifers, and all of the other organisms that I utilize, I must balance that. So they take so much air, they have so much use, and then they go away. Or I waste them out, we call it. I manage that biology. So without having feet on the ground and actually looking at processes with you,
Right.
very difficult to explain.
Sure. Yeah, I can totally appreciate that. Let me back up and let's talk about the intake process. So as you're pulling water on the intake side for the residents, so you mentioned iron and manganese earlier, but what other compounds are you testing for on a regular basis? And are there any risks to the public if those tests aren't done at a certain rate, for example?
Absolutely. So we'll look at, so I'm going to break it down as easy as I can. So we have regulated and secondary. Iron and manganese fall under that secondary portion of it. So it's taste and odor.
So it's not regulated.
It's a secondary standard we kind of want to meet, because otherwise we're going to put a product out that might be not as of quality.
Okay, that makes sense.
Where the regulated one, like say arsenic, mercury, lead, selenium, there's a whole bunch of them characterized that we test for to make sure that we're okay, which they refer to as MCLs, or maximum contaminant levels. So we're keeping an eye on that part of it. Minnesota Department of Health, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. They're two different agencies. One's for kind of a Clean Drinking Water Act, and one's for a discharge permit or environmental discharge. They work together a lot. Agencies work within each other. So like you'll bring in DNR, Department of Natural Resources of Minnesota, you'll bring in, there's a lot of professionals in these agencies, very good at what they do. They're very much, my go-to agencies for answers. So when we break it down, Minnesota Department of Health kind of set up a way where they come in, or they send the samples, and they take care of all the sampling and labs where that samples go. Okay. The other part of it is in distribution, which you have to do lead and copper sampling for the residents. You have to look at coliform sampling for the drinking water. The coliform sampling, which we do here, is very important. So a coliform is an indicator. So we'll either have present or absence. So we have sites throughout the city. We're required 15 sample a month of that distribution system. So with that distribution sampling protocol that we have to have an absent, right? So if we have a present, doesn't necessarily mean there's anything bad in water, but it means there's an indicator bacteria. So it could be an iron bacteria that wouldn't be harmful. So then there's another test that's there. So in other words, we test for coliform, it's absent, no big deal. But then we can throw a black light on it, which is an E coliform, which is an indicator that either came from soil, human, or animal. And it could possibly contain fecal matter. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's look at how soil would come into it. Well, as building codes go, materials, construction materials evolve, and testing abilities improve, we are able to then finite that sampling. So is a present coliform bad? Well, that triggers us into action, okay? So if we get one that may be a present, we then go sample that area or that region. So we try to figure out what the problem is. So it's an indicator, but not an E. coli. So then we're looking at where did this come from and why are we having it? So our best defense is a flush. So it's just a bacteria.
This is all on the distribution side, right? I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but these tests that you're referring to right now, this is all post-intake.
This is all post-intake on the water side. So before we even receive it. So then we go out and we deal with Minnesota Department of Health, district engineers. We try to identify where the issue came from. We have to resample and go back to normal operations. So it's very important and very gruesome when it comes to, or rigorous, I should say, when it comes to how that hours work.
So on the intake side, you mentioned these four elements that you test for regularly, and you test for, I believe you said maximum contaminant load. Is that correct? Is that what I heard you say?
Levels, maximum contaminant levels.
I'm sorry. Okay.
So
you mentioned arsenic, lead, and selenium. How often do you test?
That's determined by the state of Minnesota. So they will look at it, and typically it's a 2-year cycle. But that might be quarterly. If we're getting close to a maximum contaminant level, they'll increase that sampling frequency. So right now we're looking.
Please, Charlie.
Right now we're looking great. We don't have any influence, and we're not seeing a whole lot of movement on that aquifer, so it's being protected pretty well. If it starts to climb up, let's say nitrates, so nitrates. We can go into that a little bit, but one of the issues with nitrates, and it's just so happens that MCL is 10, but it's really terrible what they call blue babies. So in other words, if we have too much of that, and infants are very subject to this, they will it replaces that air oxygen molecule. It'll attach to it, so it'll take up that air. So that's why they call them blue babies. So
what's the source of nitrates? Where does that come from?
It can come from sources, say runoff. It can come from degradation. It can come from over fertilizing. If it gets into that groundwater. So that's that wellhead protection system that we have in place. So if there's over application, a flood zone, potential, breaks, from pollution and or fertilizers, that's where it can. It naturally occurs just because of the biomass of the earth. But, it doesn't help that we can emphasize or multiply that either.
Right. Well, Charlie, you're a wealth of knowledge, and I want to make sure I ask you a couple other questions. One of
Sure.
which is, are there lead pipes in the municipal distribution system? Is that still a practice, or are there still remnants of lead pipes in the distribution system? And if so, is that cause for concern?
So when we look at our infrastructure, our assets, that's one of the things that they've been doing a great job over time. Remember, this is a very old community. I mean, this is not new by any
Right.
means. So we can outdate a lot of cities out there just because there was a lot of progress here back in the day. Now,
Mhm.
standard materials or building materials, again, as we get older, we learn, right? Or we get experience. And as time passes, so more testing, right? So that was part of the materials way back when. They learned real quick that, okay, we're going to go to copper, or we're going to go to some other building material. So over the years, looking at the water mains, collection system, and infrastructure, they've been identifying and replacing and updating with current materials throughout time.
Mhm.
So are there still, so we got to remember that plumbing, it may not be 100% lead, but let's say the brass that they've used for the plumbing code for X amount of years worked great. Well, there's lead in the seats, and it's a concoction of lead, zinc, and brass to give that malleable metal so we can get a seat on things, so shut valves off. So if we look at the building materials and the plumbing codes, over time, things are changing as we become aware of certain things. So is there still lead service pipes? Not to my knowledge. Although, do you know absolutely everything that's in the ground? I can't go look at it. And is there certain things? I would think not, potentially, but nothing I'm aware of that I'm saying that's 100% lead pipe. Now, there are some communities, that have programs. So this extensive testing of lead and copper and trying to figure out where things are at and looking at your assets, your infrastructure, and looking at what's going on out there and targeting things that need to be changed. That's part of what we do too.
Mhm. So on the wastewater side, who is it that's, so you said the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency issues your discharge permit. How often do they test the quality of that water? And let me just ask you directly, would you feel comfortable drinking that water?
So we're at and I wish I had a demonstration for you because I should have
Yeah.
grabbed them. So back in the day, right, you could see it was clear, it was opaque, it looked good to drink, smelled fine, drink it, right? Well, with our discharge going to the river, sometimes tough to tell.
Mm-hmm.
So we're at that precipice right now in technology that there are some states that don't have our luxury of having this much water or availability to water that are recharging the aquifers with their discharge and pumping on the other end.
Oh,
So
interesting.
how far away are we, and what would it take if we had a closed loop system? And how do we get that past the public to say that's going to be okay?
Yeah. Brainerd Public Utilities is a municipally owned utility. And I'm curious, are there any opportunities for citizens to get involved in any way, shape, or form to support your work or to somehow do outreach? What opportunities are there for local citizens to get involved?
Jason, like we said, I've spoken with you before, and the problem that I kind of came in to was the COVID situation we are right now, because I'm going to be doing a lot of outreach for participation and concerned citizens and trying to do one of the biggest problems that I've ran through with all my years in these facilities is that the education of the elected officials. So when we start talking residents and elected officials and or whatever that layer is, to bring in a new person that may not know anything that we do because they got another profession that they're involved in,
Mm-hmm.
to educate them how this works. So if I can start doing some outreach and working with CLC or any of the internships that go on and try to, I put on tours. Obviously with COVID, it's been a little bit restricted, but try to educate the public and reach out to them so they understand it's definitely not magic, and it's very expensive what we do. And if we can work together on this, and we can help each other. So if we look at like pre-treatment agreements, so industries, that goes along with this too. So any industry that's in town, we'll look at them and see if there is a potential to hurt the plant and maybe give us stuff we can't treat. So then there's alternative routes for that. So along with just the treatment that we're just receiving, we also look at our industry and we work well with them. So all the industries in town, like I just met with Burlington Northern, Santa Fe, yesterday at their yard there in Brainerd. Impressive place, doing a really good job. Can we do better? Potentially. And working together, we may get there. And so right now, it's all good.
There's a Superfund site at the border of Brainerd and Baxter, and where evidently railroad equipment was treated for many years. Is that a risk to the water at all, to the municipal drinking water?
So the history on that is that when that went decommission, and they come in to decommission, and the agencies will come in and test, they realized there was an issue. So they did a bunch of entombment and pumping and stuff like that, which I think is the 6th renewal. So you have agencies, MPCA, EPA, you have contracted companies managing that. So we're up for renewal. So we're re-looking at everything over there and making sure that we're either containing it, treating it, or getting somewhere with it. So I think it's the 6th renewal or investigation. So we'll be working on that. I think that comes due in 22. So
final question in just about 15 to 20 seconds, if you will. I'm curious, what motivates you to do this work, Charlie? Why did you gravitate towards this profession?
At a very young age, I realized I loved fishing, hunting, and back then, it's not as good as it was. It is now. So the Mississippi River was near and dear to me. I've worked, every one of my jobs in career has been with the Mississippi River. So it's important to me. When industry would just dump and just go right out into the receiving waters, and that was standard practice. That's just what it was. So the evolution of the drinking water, the evolution of the resources, we can find a really good line between industry and production, human population. We have the technology to do this. We just got to be able to move forward with it.
We're about out of time, and I just wanted to thank you for the work that you do on behalf of our neighbors and our environment, and also want to thank you for making time for our conversation today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
And thank all of you for joining us once again. I'm Jason Edens, your host of Lakeland Currents. Be kind and be well. We'll see you next week.